Welcome to the 6th video in this series. Now, in this video, I was 16 weeks out, I believe. At this point, it's been hard to remember how many weeks out I am, just because I'm a few weeks behind with recording and posting YouTube videos. So I think this was 16 weeks out. This was my third week of massing, I believe. Now, for this video, I wanted to address a few things. First up, how the massing phase went at this point, and in general, issues with short mass phases or bulks. Then, exercise selection tips for the chest, bicep, tricep, and forearms. Those were the body parts I was specializing on during this short mass phase, and so I thought it would be helpful for me to discuss those body parts and exercise selection for them specifically. So first up, how the massing phase went at this point. For the first 2 weeks, I really struggled to tell whether or not I was in a deficit. Long story short, I came off medication that made me less hungry than usual. Specifically, the medication itself made me hungrier than usual, and so coming off of it made me less hungry than I was accustomed to, which meant coming out of this cut and starting this mass phase, I had to switch my food choices a lot to enable me to get in sufficient calories to actually gain weight, which meant I switched from more vegetable heavy or less calorie dense foods to more calorie dense foods. And in fact, it got to the point where most of my meals were what most people would consider almost junk food, just making sure I still get enough protein in, but otherwise the main concern just being getting the calories in. And so because that food is so calorie dense, the food weight I was consuming, so how much actual weight I was eating as food, reduced by quite a substantial amount, which then meant it was hard to tell whether or not I was gaining weight. I made an Instagram post about this a few weeks back now, but essentially because I switched my food choices around so much, it made it very difficult to tell whether or not I was gaining tissue or not. And so I sort of had to do my best to trust the process, just get insufficient calories and ignore the scale for a few weeks and not go crazy and think I was ruining my progress. That's an example of a broader issue with short bulks or short massing phases, which is that it can be very difficult to tell whether or not you're actually gaining tissue, because water weight fluctuations can be large enough to offset those changes. And so if you're not careful, and or if you don't have enough data for your diet as a whole, you can get into a situation where you constantly increase calories because you think you're not gaining weight, when in reality you are gaining weight. It's just the difference in water weight and food weight that's happening and masking that increase in tissue weight, let's say. And by tissue weight, I'm referring to muscle tissue, fat tissue, and so forth. But yeah, by the end of this mass, spoiler, because I'm now in my maintenance phase, I did gain maybe around 2 kilograms of actual tissue in 5 weeks. So that was fine. But for the first 2 weeks, I was really uncertain as to whether I'd actually gained weight. But sticking it out, making sure I got enough calories in, and trusting the process a little bit did seem to help out overall. Now I'll move on to discussing exercise selection for the chest, the biceps, the triceps, and the forearms. Again, those were the body parts I was specializing on during this massing phase. In general, with exercise selection as a whole, not just for any specific body parts, there are a few things to consider. Make sure it's stable. So if it's too unstable, like doing a squat and a bicep ball, for example, that might stop you from reaching local muscular failure as far as force production goes. And we know that's preferable to unstable conditions for muscle growth. Then the second thing would be making sure you can adequately load it. So let's say you can only do 2 reps of bodyweight dips. In that case, bodyweight dips just aren't a good exercise for your chest because you can't load them lightly enough to be productive. And vice versa, if you have an exercise, let's say you don't have any weights available and you want to do squats for your quads, if you have to do sets of more than 50 reps to reach failure on squats with just your body weight, then those also likely aren't a great option for growth. So loading, stability, range of motion's another one. you probably want exercises that take your target muscle groups through a pretty long range of motion. Ideally, that is especially true for the stretched out portion. So you want to make sure that whatever exercise you're picking get you as deep of a stretch as you can, pain-free as far as connective tissue is concerned. Because getting a stretch on a muscle group typically does hurt a little bit. But whatever exercises you wind up selecting probably should have a stretch component to them. And ideally would also have a pretty full range of motion as far as the peak contraction is concerned. But it's likely, from our current understanding of the literature, that getting a peak contraction isn't nearly as important as a deep stretch for muscle growth. We know this from the isometric training literature, the range of motion literature, sort of mechanistic understanding of passive and active tension, where passive tension increases and increases as muscle length increases. But yeah, so that's the third consideration, range of motion. Ideally, a pretty big stretch component under tension. And then you could consider stuff like the fatigue components. So certain exercises just are more fatiguing than others. And so while the stimulus they provide is the same, they may be more fatiguing. And so if you can only recover from so much fatigue per week, you want to maximize how much stimulus you're getting for that fatigue, which is where the stimulus fatigue ratio component or concept, I suppose, came from. And so an example here would be bent over face pulls with free weights versus standing face pulls with cables, for example, where bending over does fatigue your core, lower back, hamstrings, glutes a bit more than just standing up straight. And in general, being seated down does reduce fatigue for stabilizer muscle groups as compared to standing up. And so generally speaking, you want to, where possible, unless there's a proportional increase in stimulus, you want to avoid exercises where you're standing up versus seated, and you want to avoid exercises where you're bent over versus standing up. So for the chest specifically, I think with a lot of free weight exercises, at least barbell exercises, most people don't get quite as much of a stretch on the chest as they would with, for example, a machine fly, where they can get a really, really good stretch on the chest. And so I think including one exercise where you get a deep stretch on your chest, which you don't really get that much from free weight pressing, is a good option. I'd say typically between 2 and 4 exercises for the chest is a good start. You probably don't need more than 4 because it's not a very complicated muscle group, and so going above 4 doesn't really do all that much. But below 2 probably also doesn't make sense because there is an upper and lower chest and they have slightly different functions, and so if you want to get good chest growth overall, I think at least 2 exercises is a good option. For the bicep, for me specifically, in this mesocycle, I did close grip flat Smith machine press, as you just saw, and then some machine flies, some incline push-ups with deficit, and by incline I just mean mimicking an incline press angle. Incline push-ups, machine flies, Smith machine press, machine bench press, and incline dumbbell press at a 45-degree angle. Overall, just making sure you get a decent amount of work in for both your lower chest and upper chest. Then for the bicep, one big consideration is selecting curl variations where your bicep is more lengthened. You accomplish this by having your shoulder be hyperextended or behind you, like in an incline curl or a Beijing curl. A Beijing curl is just a curl on a cable stack where your shoulder's behind you. Those 2 exercises are pretty good options for the bicep because they place more of a stretch on the long head. The short head doesn't get impacted by shoulder position because it only works to flex the elbow, but the long head probably does get a bit more growth out of this exercise, for example here, which is a hammer curl, a hammer Bayesian curl, I suppose. Then for the tricep, I think a lot of your tricep work should come from isolation work. This is because your long head of the tricep inserts the shoulder, which means when you're doing compound exercises for pressing, the long head is shortening at the elbow but lengthening at the shoulder, which means it doesn't change length that much, which means most compound pressing exercises don't actually train the long head through a full range of motion, quote unquote. And because it's lengthening at one joint but shortening at the other, it can't contribute that much force production wise, to the exercise, and just doesn't get as good of a stimulus from those exercises as it does from isolation exercises. And so if you're already doing compound pressing exercises for your chest, I think most of your direct tricep will actually come from isolation exercises instead. Specifically, as with curls being optimal when your shoulder is slightly hyperextended and placing more of a stretch on your bicep, the same reasoning applies to the tricep, where having your shoulder overhead, so an overhead extension with a dumbbell, with a cable, etc., places more of a stretch on the long head of the tricep than pushdowns or skull crushers. Pushdowns place the least stretch on the long head, and skull crushers place an intermediate amount of stretch, but overhead extensions place the most stretch on the long head. And as with the short head of the bicep, the other two heads of the tricep aren't impacted by shoulder position because they only act at the elbow, and so they only do elbow extension. So whatever you do with your shoulder doesn't impact how much growth or how much stimulus they get out of a tricep exercise. And then finally, for the forearms, I think there's really only, unless you're considering training the wrist extensors, which can be done if you're really trying to optimize forearm growth. Like if forearm growth is one of your primary concerns for some reason, whether it's you have really lagging forearms or you just like the aesthetics of it, I think mostly just training the wrist flexors is a good idea, because that's where most of your bang for buck time-wise comes from. And so for the wrist flexor specifically, there are really only two considerations, whether you're doing standing wrist curls or wrist curls on a bench. I vastly prefer wrist curls on a bench. You get more range of motion, you get a deeper stretch in your forearm, wrist flexors. You're not standing up, which is a bit less fatiguing. The resistance cut is a lot better because you, in a standing wrist curl with the bar in your hands as you're standing or dumbbells in your hands, peak tension or the hardest point in the exercise typically occurs near the fully contracted position, which is essentially the opposite of what you want for hypertrophy. And so I think most of the time sticking to seated exercises for your forearms, like a dumbbell wrist curls on a bench or a barbell wrist curl on a bench, tends to be a better option. So yeah, those are my thoughts on exercise selection for those body parts. I think implements, so cables versus dumbbells versus barbells versus machines, those mostly come down to stimulus to fatigue ratio, as in what allows you to get the most range of motion, what gives you a good pump, a good mind-muscle connection. For example, I typically steer away from barbell benching personally because I don't get as deep of a stretch on my chest as I would from dumbbells or a machine. And I think that reasoning should be applied to a lot of exercises. So what's another example? Yeah, so for overhead tricep extensions, if you do dumbbell overhead tricep extensions with both arms at the same time, so with one dumbbell, typically most people just don't get as deep of a stretch because the dumbbell hits their back before they get a full stretch. And in that situation, replacing that exercise with the unilateral dumbbell overhead extension or with a cable unilateral overhead extension just does better because you get more of a stretch in your tricep, you get a full range of motion, and so overall the stimulus to fatigue ratio of the exercise improves. And I think that's a decent way of selecting exercises. For the bicep, I think somewhere between 2 and 5 exercises is sufficient. They're not that complicated, they don't have that many functions, but because you're doing a lot of volume for them, selecting more exercises can be beneficial because you want to avoid overuse injuries. For the tricep, they are a bit more complicated, but you're also performing typically fewer sets per week because they have lower MRVs and slightly lower MEVs. And so I think, again, 2 to 5 exercises per week is a good range. Finally, for the forearms, I think, honestly, 1 to 3 exercises is sufficient. I've rarely run into any overuse injuries from doing too many wrist curls on without sufficient exercise variation, and very few people I've come across have had that issue. And so even though you can do a lot of volume for your wrist curls per week, because the forearms, well, the wrist flexors specifically, are pretty straightforward, like they essentially just get a good stimulus out of flexing your wrist, doing more than 1 to 3 exercises isn't strictly beneficial as far as growth is concerned. And because they don't suffer high overuse injury rates, it also isn't necessary from an injury prevention perspective. But yeah, that essentially wraps up the video. I'm just finishing up with some Beijing curls. As you can see, I'm getting a full stretch on the way down by letting my shoulder hyperextend. And yeah, that's essentially the video. This video was 16 weeks out. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a comment, like, subscribe, let me know what you want improved or done differently. I'll try and keep making these weekly, and I'll see you next week.